So thank you very much for being either connected or attending in person here in Grenoble and as a parallel session during the NanoSafe conference. This is the second legal workshop of our great project, SABYDOMA. And today's topic is about the recent safe and sustainable by design recommendation and all the questions around this recommendation from the European Commission. With an important question is whether this safe and sustainable by design paradigm could challenge liability in regulatory regimes. And for this, of course, we have some background, which you will see on the next slide. Just in a nutshell, of course, this will be reminded at the beginning of this workshop by Andrew Nelson and Ignasi Gispert from our SABYDOMA project. But the review of the state of the art of safe, and at that time we spoke only about safe by design. Since then we have added and sustainable approaches is really part of the efforts in work package 6 of the project. So this is really a commitment we have as a project which makes our project complementary to the other projects funded by the European Commission under the same call. And so to this end, and some of you, and we know that some of you attended the first legal workshop organized more than 2 years ago on the 28th of January. And that was at that time entirely online because we're still in the middle of the pandemics. But it covered the following aspects. If you recall, we spoke about regulatory regimes for nanotechnologies in Asia and in the EU. And we have Mohamed Ershadul Karim attending online today, and he was the legal scholar presenting on the Asian regime. We had a presentation on by design approaches and interdisciplinarity. We had also done by all members of the project a safe by design educational literature presentation. And then we had a quite original approach about technologies by design, and we will come back to this today, lessons we can draw from the privacy by design principle. And at the end, and like we will have today, we had a roundtable discussion which covered scientific philosophy also and legal aspects of the safe by design concept, which became since then the safe and sustainable by design. And indeed, a lot of water on the bridge since then, including the Commission recommendation of the 8th of December last year. And we are very happy that today, among the speakers, we have experts who worked actually on the preparation of this recommendation. Of course, on the next slide, we have a question, and in terms of background, just a few words. We are moving from product safety to product safety and sustainability by design. And lawyers, we like to speak and play with the words and the meaning of the words. That's a whole life lawyers are spending on, is playing with the words. And the term product will have here a wide definition that includes chemicals, materials, manufactured articles, much more complex articles. And indeed, and that will be the same for all jurisdictions in the world, because we have lawyers presenting today, again, from the perspective of other jurisdictions than the European Union and the member states of the European Union. Product safety is something absolutely not new, and we are quite familiar with that. And indeed, it classically imposes requirements on manufacturers. And in lieu of the manufacturers, sometimes the importers and distributors. So typically, what is relevant in that legislation is market placement. It's not a design stage. And so therefore, as a general principle, manufacturers are held liable in the very different EU liability regimes. Sustainability requirements are much more recent in European law, and that we will see that today again in one of the last presentations. Legal terminology, as I said, is important, and that the safety and sustainability of a product is by design, that raises several questions, and there are 4 of them at least, but it's just, I would say, an overview. First of all, and this is really like an open question, and you will see in the presentations and the roundtable we have at the end, you will get some answers to these questions. Does the fact that the design of a product must integrate the safety and sustainability requirements really differ from the manufacturing requirements already existing in product safety legislation? So the question is there really anything new under the sun? A second question is, does the terminology change mean, or could it mean, that there is a paradigm shift from the manufacturing stage to the design stage in terms of legal approach? Also, another question is, could it mean that there is or there will be a liability shift? This is really a question for lawyers, which is quite probably intriguing for scientists, and we will try to clarify this this afternoon. Are product designers, in other words, researchers and inventors, likely to be exposed to liability claims? Of course, the purpose is not to make the scientific community afraid of anything, but to clarify if there are any consequences of really moving from one concept to another one. And also, or will regulatory regimes include compliance with the safe and sustainable by design concept and assess if compliance is satisfactory? So these are a few questions, and you will see on the next slide with the program you all received and which was available online. The program on the next slide. Thank you. And of course, we have, first of all, we will have a presentation on the key findings in our project by Andrew Nelson and Ignasi Gispert. And then afterwards, we will have Hubert Rauscher from the European Commission, who will make a presentation from a regulatory perspective on the European Commission recommendation of the 8th of December last year. Afterwards, we have our two distinguished legal scholars and lawyers connecting, will be presenting respectively from Malaysia and from New York. Mohammed Nizam Awang presenting on an Asian perspective, and Paul Majkowski, attorney at the New York and New Jersey bars, presenting on the American perspective. Afterwards, we will have a question and answer session, which is the best way also not to keep our speakers connecting really from distance, too long connected because of the time difference, of course, you will understand. We will have a coffee break, but that will be only here in Grenoble. Unfortunately, we cannot share the coffee with you, for those of you connecting. And then we will have a presentation done by myself on by design approaches and liability in EU law. And then we will be joined also by Professor Leonie Reins from the Erasmus University Rotterdam. She will be connected also online, who will present what is the topic of a paper currently being published on the safe and sustainable by design concept, regulatory approach for more sustainable circular economy in the European Union. And after that, we have 1 hour for roundtable with 4 panelists. 3 of them will have already done a presentation during the workshop, Andrew Nelson, Ignasi Gispert, and Hubert Rauscher, but we will also be joined by Dalila Antunes, who is also a member of a project, but who is currently speaking in another session of NanoSafe, because a lot of things are going on in parallel here in Grenoble. Then there will be, after this 1 hour roundtable, a question and answer session, and then we will finish by 6 p.m. So that you can still enjoy the evening for those of you who are in the same time zone. That being said, I now immediately invite on floor first Andrew Nelson, of course, for the presentation, and thank you very much. Andrew, please join.
Yeah. Okay.
And you just have to stand here.
Yeah. Okay. I'll get the. I just want to say I don't do right, left, links. Go.
Yeah.
Direction. No, Ischiata. Yeah.
Yes.
I have a loud voice anyway, as I'm told by all my relatives. Anyway. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not very good on my feet, I'm afraid. All I can do at my age is ride a bike. I can do that very well. Okay. So I'm really happy to be here, and I want to thank Anthony that we met here 5 years ago, and we found we had a lot of interest in common because I'd just come out of teaching an 8-year philosophy and ethics of science course, which I developed actually there, and it's going very well. But since I think 2018, I stopped teaching it. But I'm really interested in philosophical and legal issues actually. So I haven't been heading this work package. I'm actually just presenting it, but actually Maria Dushinska, who's really worked extremely hard on this and put all her heart into it, has organised and developed the whole deal. But I'm happy to talk about it and field questions later. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so the objectives were really, especially on risk assessment, management, governance of nanomaterials, how tools, testing procedures, and analytical methods are consistent with regulatory requirements for nanomaterials. And I should add at this stage that SABYDOMA, the core of SABYDOMA, is the core of the way I've been thinking for many years, is technology. It has been a technological solution to safety by design, as they'll come out on Friday when we talk about the project in detail. But this technology is underwritten by mathematical and simulation techniques, which are very closely associated and integrated with technology. And the whole platform is underwritten by the legal and governance approach and Maria's work package. So that's a bit of background. Okay, and this risk assessment and so on is integrated with methodology, that technology, into a decision support model. And that approach has in fact been very successful. And they've integrated this decision support tool into the platform, complementary with the modular decision support for the risk government frameworks currently being developed in other projects. And this whole deal is to ensure efficient management of SABYDOMA's project data. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so the tasks are as follows. Task 6.1 was a review of the current to date SBD approaches and guidance documents for nanomaterial development aligned with existing Horizon 2020 projects, and there have been several of them on risk governance of nanotechnology. Task 6.2 is specifically concerned with data management. Task 6.3 is the risk assessment and management SOPs applicable in the early development of nanomaterials. And task 6.4 is actually really important, is to integrate this decision support tool into the platform, complementary with the modular support tools in the other projects. Now, it just so happens that Maria Dushinska is coordinating another project, RiskOn, and she's therefore able to match our project very closely with her NMBP 13 project. And then it leads us to task 6.5, which my friend Ignasi, my colleague, is going to talk about after I finish. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, the main achievements and highlights. There have been many. The best practice guidance documents have been reviewed. Advanced SBD approaches and risk governance compared with approaches in USA, Asia, and Australia. Second, report on SBD approaches and needs to meet regular requirements has been done, and I identification of the existing best practices and guidelines. And the third one, which we're all very honoured to be included as authors, and I had to confirm my correct address on, because the paper is now in revision stage, and we're all very proud of this. It's actually a paper, I think the leading guy, he had the second name Trump.
Benjamin Trump.
How can I forget them? Benjamin, but I do like Benjamin. Firstborn, lastborn, youngest. Safety by design and engineered materials, the need to move from theory to practice. And there it is, the paper in PDF form. Okay, next slide, please. And yes, as Anthony told us, we had our first legal workshop, and actually that was incredibly innovative and exciting, and it was a real achievement. And the number of people that had come up to me and said how much they enjoyed it. I mean, it's really fantastic, and thank you, Anthony. I'm so glad that we had that conversation 5 years ago. We spoke the same language, actually. Now we had a second workshop, a stakeholders' perspective of safe and sustainability by design in February 2022. A video has been produced of SBD in the current lecture presented by Dalila Antunes in Factor Social, and that's available on YouTube. And Maria Dushinska has carried out a course on good laboratory practice and best practices with handling nanomaterials. So we've really achieved quite a lot. Let's, next slide. So this is all about the first workshop that Anthony was talking about. And I can see some of the speakers there. I remember Blanca Suarez, Sean Kelly, of course, an old mate of mine, Zinnia Tria, Victor Puntes, yeah, he was in our last project. It was really good. And of course, Eva Selmy Jones, who's actually on the project. So there were some really good people on that. And it was a wonderful workshop. It really was good. And I have to say, we did all this during the pandemic. I remember running the whole project from my little room in Leeds, top floor, you know, converted bedroom. Okay, next slide, please. So we are aligning with H2020 risk assessment, risk and government projects. As I've said, Risk On is one of them, Maria Dushinska. We are collaborating very, very closely with sister NMBP 15 projects, Asina, Sabina, and SBD for Nano. And I invite you all to come at 11:30 on Wednesday morning, and you will hear how exciting our collaboration has been. And we're going to talk about, first of all, you're going to get a 5-minute overview from me, which I hope is not too boring. And then you'll get each person, including our Matt here, to talk about the individual projects for 5 minutes. So I do hope you'll attend. It's going to be a very exciting time. And then you'll also hear about the NMBP 16 projects, which are also the same topic. So we have all been working very well together. And I remember we had our first meetings. It's kind of sentimental, but I remember it was when the pandemic started and we were all at home. You know, there were noises of kids in the background. And it was just great fun. You know, we got a very close relationship. I don't know if Soko, she's Sabina coordinator, will be here. There's someone presenting for her because she's had a bereavement, very sadly. But Anna Costa and Carlos Vito are here from Asino SBD for Nano. And we've had a first interaction with Park, the Partnership for the Assessment of Risk for Chemicals. And I noticed actually there's a talk on this. I'm especially interested in that because actually I'm very interested in chemical toxicology and actually pharmacology as well, in addition to nanomaterials. Okay, next slide, please. And okay, this is all about the Enos cloud platform, which has been built by Nova Mechanics, Andreas, my name, Afantitis, and he's built up a computational infrastructure for this decision framework. So that's been also going on as well. And we've got this tool ready for anyone to use at the end of the project. Okay, next slide. I think we're all there. So I really acknowledge all the SABYDOMA team, who are one of the best teams in the world to attack this kind of problem. And I'm proud and honoured to have coordinated and run this project. And I thank you for putting up with me for the last 8-10 minutes. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Andrew. And now we'll give the floor to Ignasi to present more in details one of the tasks of work package 6.
Thank you very much, Anthony. Yeah, we are. I will try to present very briefly. I'm very connected with the workshop today. What we have been working in task 5 of work package 6, because what we tried is to start proposing a discussion of on the need of using especially to use experimental regulation in the framework of safety and sustainability by design. And we had to start by making a zoom out and saying, okay, where it came from, safety and sustainability by design ideas. They came from the chemical strategy, but even though, even before that, the European Green Deal. And I think that the important is to start analyzing the foundations of the European Green Deal. What is the direction that the European Green Deal is giving us, and taking a clear view of what they are asking us, the European Green Deal. That is the idea of this first slide, to realize that we are talking of a radical systemic change. It's not a new strategy. It's a different strategy from the European Union. And I think that that will change how we see the policy landscape and how we see the regulation landscape. And I really think that we need to be grounded on the European Green Deal to understand what is the direction we are heading and what is the safety and sustainability by design ideas. Especially because this new growth strategy that presents the European Green Deal, it's founded on a very important and differential idea and policy development, that is ecological primacy. For the first time in the history of the European community, the Commission, what is telling us is that social and economical realities has to be based on ecological primacy. And that is a fundamental, even a philosophical change on the idea of the European Union. And I think that that makes a radical change that needs to be very much in line with what we do. So based on that idea of the importance, the radical importance of the European Green Deal, what we started was by extracting what are the fundamental ideas that give us policy directions to us in order to analyze what is new regimes that can be found, that we can develop from the safety and sustainability by design. that basic ideas was that the need to review and critically assess, to be brave enough as to really analyze if what we have now is what we need for the future. And that means, I think, a policy courage to be able to recognize where we are. Obviously, we also consider that safety and sustainability by design give us a new approach to chemical policy. And that it's important to realize that it's the new approach of the foundations of chemical regulation also. And that I think that is an important also idea to have in mind. Obviously, the better regulation toolbox also have been seen from a new perspective thanks to the European Green Deal. And this idea that better regulation tools are not only a technical tools to analyze the quality of a regulation, but must be tools for developing special laws for a special purpose. That is the regulation with purpose. It's not anymore the idea of just if it's a nice regulation or if it's a very well done technically regulation. The idea is efficacious and efficient for reaching the goals. And the goals are the European Green Deal's goals. Importance of technological infrastructure to help innovation and of the innovation-friendly regulation. That are both concepts are very, very closely linked as a framework structures for helping innovation that also are very closely associated. And finally, the European Green Deal clearly encourages experimentation in general and regulatory experimentation specifically. That's are the 5 key points that we were based to propose these regulatory new possibilities that offer safety and sustainability by design. We are based on 3 different legs, 3 different pillars. One is experimental regulation in the form of a regulatory innovation trial. Regulatory innovation trial, it's a different category from regulatory sandboxes. And it's why we choose regulatory innovation trials, because in this case, we are trying to analyze different regulatory systems. And that is the importance of our proposal. Obviously, we take stock not only of the safety and sustainability by design recommendation, but also on all the work done by the NanoReg 1 and 2, and also from the OECD that now are taking over all the SSIR ideas. And basically, we were very much interested in the regulatory preparedness and the trusted environment for safety and sustainability by design. And finally, we also take stock of all the work done by the Commission in technological infrastructures. And from all those that exist nowadays, we were focused on open innovation testbeds because they are helping innovation really from TRL 3, 4 to TRL 7. So with these 3 basic pillars in mind, what we have proposed is a regulation innovation hub for medical devices. It was a reason. The idea, what is the basic idea? The idea is to complement an OETB with the regulatory approval process, in the sense that we use safety and sustainability by design recommendation to create standards for being able to make a joint process in which, in the same innovation process, you also have the approval process based on SSbD standards that obviously will be developed from the key performance indicators that are being produced in the framework. Next, please. So just to finish, 3 basic ideas. We make we realize that there's a very limited connection now in between regulation and technological infrastructure. Are those separate worlds that what we are trying now is to match them in one single process. that is the core idea of the Regulatory Innovation Hub. Obviously, we need to transform the safety and sustainability by design to transform in a standard that can be used and followed by industry in a clear way, as clear as are being followed the international standards. And obviously, if they are harmonized the standards, then we enter on all the idea of the new approach, regulations to harmonization and standardization. And finally, the idea of a regulatory innovation trial is because it's hard law. We are not relying on soft law instruments that at the end are voluntary and loose instruments. We are trying, or we are proposing, a hard law instrument. And the beauty of the regulatory innovation trials is that you can create a safe environment in which you can test new regulatory frameworks without endangering all the regulation that you already have. So basically, that's where what we have developed in work package 5. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ignasi, for this presentation. Now we are moving to the next presentation by Dr. Hubert Rauscher from the European Commission on the recommendation of the 8th of December 2022 on safe and sustainable by design assessment framework. And you will speak it from a regulatory perspective. You have the floor. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anthony. Stand here. Is that okay? Okay. Thank you. Good afternoon, and thanks a lot for inviting me to this workshop, which has a quite avant-gardistic topic, from my point of view, because we talk already about SSbD in regulation and a standardized SSbD approach. From my point of view, that's very avant-gardistic. But the JRC, as you know, is not part of from my point of view, which is only my point of view, not that of the Commission, of course. So next slide, please. I mean, legal approach to SSbD, maybe if I can say that in this workshop, it's kind of a view into a far away potential future that may or may not take place. But anyway, we are here now. And this is the points I would like to talk about. So maybe a little because this is a policy approach from the Commission. So therefore, I would like to give you a little bit of insight into the policy, where the SSbD framework comes from. SSbD framework itself, very, very briefly, because there is no time to talk in detail about that. If you are interested in more details about the framework itself, about the scientific content, I would invite you to go on Wednesday morning to a presentation about the SSbD framework itself. Then I will talk about the EC recommendation, what I have made out of that framework, and then still give you a little bit of a perspective from the present point of view. Next slide, please. So what we want to achieve, and we is the European Commission, and I think the society as a whole in Europe at least, what we want to achieve is to make the chemicals and the materials safe and sustainable to protect the human health and the environment. And this is a quite ambitious policy goal. So it's a policy, a policy of the European Commission. And this is very important, that this is this policy is being established, because the policy becomes before the regulation. One has to have a policy to make a regulation, because no regulation without policy. This is very important to keep in mind. So therefore, let's talk a little bit about the policy that is behind the SSbD framework. Next slide, please. You know, that has already been mentioned here, that all this is based on the European Green Deal, which is one of the priorities of the current European Commission. So the European Green Deal is policy, and it is a new growth strategy aiming to transform the European Union into a really modern, resource-efficient and competitive economy. And when you read the Green Deal, you will see some goals, and these are really, really ambitious. It says the European Union will become climate neutral by 2050. That this is really ambitious. Protect human life, animals and plants by cutting the pollution. But on the other hand, also help the companies to become the world leaders in clean products and technologies, and leave nobody behind, they say. So to help to ensure just and inclusive transition, that also the weak, let's say, participants in the society, small companies, they can follow this transition. So this is the big goal. Next slide, please. And one of the, so out of this big goal about this from this Green Deal, several strategies have evolved. And one of these strategies is the chemical strategy for sustainability towards a toxic-free environment. This we also know. It comes from the ambitions of the Green Deal to become climate neutral, to cut pollution, some call it zero pollution, and to move towards a more circular economy. And the chemical strategy is one strategy to achieve this. And here are the goals of the chemical strategy. One aims to strengthen the protection of the human health and the environment from hazardous chemicals. And it wants also to drive the innovation to design, develop safe and sustainable chemicals and materials. So it's an innovation driver. And also it aims to phase out the most harmful chemicals. They should not be used anymore. And substances of concern should be substituted as far as possible, or their use should be minimized. And all this is the first steps towards also the zero pollution ambition for a toxic-free environment and in the Green Deal. And out of that chemical strategy comes an action plan, the chemical strategy action plan. And a central part of this action plan is to develop safe and sustainable by design criteria for chemicals and materials. So it's a direct outcome from the Green Deal over the chemical strategy through this action plan. And next slide, please. And therefore, the framework has been developed. With these objectives that are somehow echoed from the chemical strategy, but I would highlight some things here. So that the objectives of this framework should drive the innovation to design new chemicals based upon safe and sustainable by design. And it should also provide guidance how to do that, how to develop criteria. What is safe and sustainable by design, and then to minimize the impact human health, climate, environment by phase out the existing most harmful chemicals and substitute the substances of concern, as I said already. And it should also allow, the framework should allow to enable comparative assessment of new and existing chemicals based on certain performance criteria for a given function or application. That's important. And all this should be done by the framework that should give criteria for safe and sustainable by design that goes clearly beyond current regulatory compliance. It goes beyond current regulatory compliance. Next slide, please. The framework itself, probably you have seen this infographic very briefly. The assessment of safe and sustainable in the recommendation goes through 4 steps. there is a fifth step that is mentioned in the technical scientific background, but it is not yet taken up in the recommendation because it is still too, there are methods to develop. So these are 4 steps. And the step 1 is the hazard assessment of the chemical. Step 2 of the chemical itself without any application or so. Then the step 2 would be then in the production and processing phase, so the occupational health step. And step 3 would then be the final application phase, so the application in a product. And then step 4 would be the environmental sustainability assessment through life cycle assessment from the beginning of the development to the end of life of the chemical. Next slide, please. So JRC was tasked with develop the scientific technical background of that SSbD framework. That's what we did. First, making a review of existing approaches of safety and sustainability dimensions. And then in the middle, so this is the central part, this is the technical report where all the technical scientific background has been developed of the SSbD framework. And then the Commission has made a recommendation out of this by establishing that this framework is recommended to be applied by different stakeholders. Next slide, please. So this is the Commission recommendation from December that proposed such a European framework for SSbD chemicals and materials that is applicable to research and innovation activities. And that is quite important to where it should be applied. Okay, scientific basis, I said already, developed by the JRC, and it is addressed to the member states of the EU, please back, yeah, and industry and research and technology organizations. So those stakeholders should apply that. And the purpose of that recommendation is to test the framework as it is described in some detail in the recommendation itself, but in more detail in this technical report. To test this framework and to get the feedback in order to improve it, to check the relevance, to improve the reliability and the operability of that framework. And results from applying that framework will it then make possible after the testing and revision phase to define really safe and sustainable by design criteria. Next slide, please. Maybe I included that slide, but maybe this is really too trivial here because to understand what is a Commission recommendation, probably everyone knows that. It is a legal document, but it's a type of a document where the Commission can express its views and positions and make recommendations to stakeholders without any legal obligations, they have no binding force. So this is just as a side. Examples of such a recommendation is this framework that I just said, but another examples would be the definition of nanomaterial that we all know. So this is a recommendation. It's an official position recommendation, but without binding legal force. Next slide, please. However, this is a little bit complicated. This policy ambition, as SSbD, the Green Deal, and the strategies that come out of that have already resulted in a lot of activities and funding and research that is connected with the Green Deal. Next slide, please. Because here in the green part, you see the policy that has been developed from the Green Deal, zero pollution, chemical strategy. Next slide, please. Then there has to be flesh to the bone, right? The policy, there has to be something that comes out of the policy. And one thing here in that context is this SSbD framework that has been developed by the JRC and others in collaboration with an administrative arrangement. so that it now has become that this framework, this recommendation. Next slide, please. Furthermore, so this is then what comes out. The Commission recommendation and the Horizon Europe Framework Program for Research already picks it up and feeds it into funding of research projects. Next slide, please. And these research projects you see here that are all these calls and projects are all results of these policy ambitions and the SSbD framework. For example, you know this, for example, PARC is a huge project that should, among others, develop, help to implement the SSbD framework and the IRIS project as well, or SSbD along the life cycle, along the value chain of products. And there are other projects, calls where probably some of you have responded to these calls. These are currently being evaluated. So it is already, without having any legal obligation, it's already a lot of things going on from this recommendation on the research front. So next slide, please. So the state of play currently now, it's very important. It is applicable, the framework is applicable to research and innovation activities. At the moment, it has been published, as you know, half a year ago. Now there is 2 years of testing phase starting. And the first phase of testing with the stakeholders is actually ongoing now. So there is a call to report to the Commission on the implementation with a voluntary reporting mechanism. This call is open until the end of this month. So in case you would like to give feedback, there is a reporting template that you can download, collect input and feedback from the stakeholders. And the revision of the framework will go on throughout 2025. And then we'll see what has to be amended, what works, and what is still to be improved. And then there will be a revised framework. As this is a legal framework, I also would like to point out that the SSbD framework refers already to some existing regulatory provisions, CLP, REACH, in the safety part of the framework. All this is referred to that existing legal provisions. But to have a real regulatory implementation, like something like a regulation on SSbD would in any case need an impact assessment and first of all a check of the fit for purpose of existing legislation, like it was done with the legislation addressing nanomaterials. And what it is, the framework is a specific proposal to implement the chemical strategy and the Green Deal, nothing more and nothing less at the moment. Next slide, please. But of course, as I talk about a perspective, there are already some notable regulatory activities relevant for SSbD that are linked in a way to the framework, but of course not directly related to. For example, there's this new hazard classes in CLP as of from last year through a Commission delegated regulation. New hazard classes, PBT substances and PMT substances are now included in the CLP, and this is also used in the SSbD framework. Then there's this proposal for the Critical Raw Materials Act, that proposal for a regulation to ensure secure and sustainable supply of critical raw materials, and this is also very much related to the SSbD in a way. And then there's the eco-design proposal for regulation that proposes a framework for these eco-design requirements for sustainable products. So in a way, regulatory activities regarding more sustainability coming from the Green Deal are already ongoing. So we'll see where this will go. Next slide, please. And this is already, I think, the final slide. So this is where we are now in the timeline. When in December 2019, the European Green Deal was published. Then on the 8th of December last year, that there was this Commission recommendation on a framework for safe and sustainable by design chemicals. And now we go here to the right side, and we're starting the testing phase of the framework. And the start of the framework testing has just begun. 2 months now, that is ongoing. Feedback is being collected. Then this feedback will be analyzed by the JRC and in the Commission. And then there will be in winter this year a workshop on the feedback, guidance report, first version, and then there will be a new round of feedback collection, the same loop again. In the end, there will be a second guidance report, and hopefully in 2025, based on all this feedback, there will be a revision of the framework, and what kind of document it will assume, I don't know. I assume it will remain a recommendation for the time being. And let's see how this goes and how the Green Deal and these ambitions for the chemical strategy will be implemented. Next slide, please. Yeah, here maybe some contacts if you want to contact, if you want to have a look at the website or give feedback to the Commission, just note that back. And next slide, please. And that's the end of my presentation. And I would like to thank this SSbD team. And this is quite important. Because in the safe and sustainable by design framework, 2 worlds, 2 communities, I would not say collide, but they come together. They have to come together. They were not doing joint work, I would say, because I come more from the safety side, safety of chemicals, safety of nanomaterials, and other colleagues, they come from the sustainability side, and this is one challenge. To come together and to speak, well, to find the good language to speak together, to know what you mean. This is the first big challenge. And this we have more or less, not 100% being successful. And that was a big part of the work. And only through collaboration of the 2 different communities, the safety and sustainability, there will be such a framework and further development of that framework possible. Okay, thanks a lot.
Very much, Hubert. And now the floor goes online to Nizam Awang. We will give you necessary control. Maybe if Beatrice, we can just have Nizam also. We can see. We see you. Good.
Hi.
Good evening.
Hi.
Good evening. Yes.
Hi. Good evening. It's good evening from Malaysia. It's good morning from your side, right? Is it afternoon? Sorry, from your side.
It's the afternoon here, and it's the morning in the United States for Paul.
Yeah, it's definitely a difference.
Yes, we give you the floor.
All right. Thank you so much, Anthony, and the team for the invitation to speak at this very important forum. I am delighted to be part of this event and would like to share some insights about the liability regime and the by design paradigm from Asian perspective. Having listened to the previous speakers, there are so many things which I would love to reflect and share the insights with the audience and the community that we have in this workshop. But I will try to refrain myself from doing that too much now, but along the way I will give you some perspective on that. So from the previous speech, I can imagine that this issue when it comes to liability regime and by design paradigm is actually go beyond the legal context of discussion. As Hubert mentioned just now, policy comes first, and that's the reality, or I could say mostly the current scenario of what we have seen in most Asian countries, either they are developing or emerging economies. Can you go to the next slide, please? Right. So the recommendation proposed by the EU has actually given more thoughts about where Asia is going next. Of course, EU is quite advanced when it comes to nanotechnology in general and on sectoral basis. When it comes to chemical regulations, there have been quite a number of important documents which have been the reference of the national regulators in Asia. So allow me to bring you first in this presentation to give some ideas about what are the right law and policy mix for nanosafety, and what would be the danger or the risk of not having an enough comprehensive law to address the nanoproduct life cycle. I can relate to the previous presentation on the shifting paradigm from the product safety paradigm now to safety and sustainable by design, which is actually much more broader, taking into account the development of SDG and as well on the ESG, where it has become a regulatory requirement compliance, especially for the certain category size of the companies. On the second part of my presentation today, I'm going to look into the liability regime to give you some ideas on what are the legal and regulatory issues which has been facing the regulators in respect to the regulation of the technology on the products itself. And of course, what are the concerns raised by the stakeholders, including the scientists, the researchers, and in fact, the public included here. And finally, to give some reflective or reflexive thoughts maybe on what would be the future of by design paradigm in the context of governance and regulations of nanomaterial or nanoproducts in Asia. So let's move on to the next slide on the right framework of nano safety law and policy, and what would be the risk of not having a good law to address the whole life cycle of nano products or supply chain. Okay, go to the next slide. Right. So the next two slides actually is a SWOT analysis where I look at what are the strengths that we have in this region in what I call as the majority world, where developing and emerging economies are all here. If you see that what's happening in this region are that we do have almost all countries have already the national strategic plan, which address the nanotechnology aspect of safety and also the innovation. So we see that in some documents, for instance, in Malaysia and Thailand, they focus on safety, but there are problems in terms of striking a proper trade-off between balance between the innovation and also protection of the technology. And then the strength as well here in principle, this is quite similar to what the EC, the European Commission, has made in 2008-2007, that the government assured that the current legislation is sufficient enough to regulate the material and also the products. And on this basis, for some governments, they have launched pilot activities or pilot projects to address the priority areas on what types of nanomaterial that the government or the country would like to focus on. In other words, which material could have, an economic leverage to boost the technology growth and production. Because eventually, if you look at what's happening in this region, is related to the technology is used as a catalyst to boost the economic growth. So there are some selected areas, sectors, and also types of nanomaterial which has been promoted to become the priority or the niche material for the government to focus on. And as different from what EU is doing, which is either based on existing legislations or come up with more specific legislations, it is slightly a different development in this region, even though we do acknowledge that the existing laws are sufficient. But now the movement is more towards giving the consumer acceptance about nano products, which you can see that there are quite a number of countries which have introduced nano mark program which under different banner or names. So here you can see, since the country has already had the strategic plan, the country also has started to establish the standard and strategy of nanosafety testing, which has become one of the basic root problem when it comes to the regulation of nanomaterial or nanoproducts. And when it comes to research, even though there is a progress, but there are still a lot of things need to be done, particularly when it comes to the toxicology or ecotoxicology assessment, and also when it comes to the environmental impact of some products going into the environment, and also the aquatic or any living beings, which relates to the environmental impact. Can you go to the next slide? So despite the strength and then opportunities that this region have, we are quite caught up with problems in terms of the regulatory framework. Firstly, because there is no comprehensive ecosystem and unclear governing body. If they do have, the governing body would not have, kind of a mandate, a legal mandate to regulate. So it is quite common in the context of Asian region where you have multiple agencies, and there you see that there is a problem in terms of coordination between one agency to another, because nanotechnology is an area, as a technology itself is a platform technology where it needs to have the collaboration between agencies. So that's one of the first problems. And related to that, even though you have law, but there is very few countries which have actually proposed a comprehensive regulatory mapping exercise. So either you need to have a new law, or you can actually resort to the use of existing laws. There is a very little country who have done the mapping exercise. When I say the mapping exercise, not only just based on, literatures, but also the engagement with the stakeholders. For many reasons that the countries would like to first come up with a policy, and then only they would like to look into the regulations. So that is among the process that we have to understand. And as Anthony has mentioned in our earlier discussion, that what the EU is doing now is to look into comprehensive regulatory or policy pathway, which covers the process from lab to fab, from the research to design and manufacture. So this is actually quite lacking as well in this region, where you do have regulations on certain areas, but in some other areas they are not quite covered. So it's coming back to the issues of what is the priority of the countries when it comes to nanotechnology, whether funding is available or not, there's another issue. When it comes to the innovation, whether it is commercially enough to be put on the market, and most critically on the standard and safety testing. And because of that, there are problems when it comes to the safety standards on how to control and regulate the products in the market. And the fact that this region, if you look at, only some countries are considered as producers or manufacturers, but the rest, the majority, are the users or consumers of the nanomaterial or nanoscale substance. In other words, we produce products, but it's very difficult to find, except for China, big countries like Japan and Korea, they may have like some big manufacturers which involve in the production of nanoscale material, but the rest are still limited. So that influence somehow on how the regulation, what kind of regulation framework would be able to be presented, and also to be addressed when it comes to the issues of risk and safety. Next. So this is one sample of the national policy and strategic plan, which I took the example here from Malaysia, which took actually quite some time to be approved. I still remember that when I did PhD in 2010, and there seems to be like 10 years delay for so many reasons, I guess, because of the engagement with the stakeholders. Well, there are many people are quite new when it comes to nanotechnology regulation or safety at that particular time. So by the time we have this document now, things are going quite fast when it comes to the commercializations of nano products. But finally, we have that, and the same goes to the rest of the other countries in the region. Despite the slow movement, but things are going more faster now because the government is taking the issue of safety more seriously than before, and they can see more research being done, particularly in the EU and in the US. So more evidence brings more confidence to the policymakers and regulators, particularly to look into this issue more seriously. Next. So when it comes to the liability regime, among the questions that we always get is how does the nano product life cycle can be covered under the existing laws? And if there is any, how does it address the issue of safety and sustainability assessment to ensure not only the safety, but also the sustainability of nanomaterial itself? Okay, next slide. So the current regime, as I mentioned to you just now, rely mostly on the existing or pre-existing laws, where we do not regulate products based on the applications or the chemicals, but rather focus on the intended use of the products. And this assessment is done on product by product basis or case by case basis. So in most circumstances that when I also one of the technical committee members for the assessment of risk and safety of nano products under the ministry, there have been quite an active activities when it comes to the information gathering, either from the local context and also from what is happening at the international level. And the government is focusing not only, I guess, in Malaysia, but also this is the reality of other countries in the region as well, to build the indigenous standards. So even though we do have reference to OECD standards and guidelines, we would like to see how the standard can be actually tailor-made and customized to the local needs and industries. And as I mentioned to you just now, as opposed to what is happening to the EU and to the US, this region is focusing more on the certification system. Well, I think not because the region is not ready, but to increase more product acceptance among the consumers, and also to encourage the industries to share more information and disclose more information, particularly about the product and the risk which can be accompanied or associated to the products. Next. Right, so when it comes to the issues relating to safety and sustainability assessment, the countries are quite clear when it comes to the direction of where the industry is going next. Okay, go to the next slide. So this is quite a strong evidence where the numbers of, we can see here the numbers of the Asian countries which have become participating members and also observers at OECD TC 229. So they have, particularly for some countries like Japan, Korea, they have become and China, they have become very instrumental in the development. But what about the rest of the developing and emerging economies in this region? So they are rather followers rather than the leaders. But of course, the countries are focusing more on the specific areas for the development of nanotechnology rather than having, a big agenda, but they're focusing because of there are so many other priorities in the region beside this technology and development. Next. So if you see here that this is what is happening in Japan, where it was reported there was no really a legal framework when it comes to address the issue of safety of nanomaterial in the present system. And what they do is actually more on encouraging the industry to share the information about safety testing or information relating to the characteristics or characterizations of nanomaterials in the end products. Next. The same goes with Korea as well, but interestingly, can you go to the next slide? What is happening in Korea is rather interesting because they introduce the chemical regulations, which is very closely reflected from the EU REACH. But of course, they they have agreed to come up with a separate treatment of products or chemicals containing nanomaterials. So when it comes to the issues of the classifications of nano as products or regulatory category, there is no particular reference to the chemicals by particle size. So unless it raises unique or particular risk, then there will be a separate assessment on that material. Next. The same goes with the registration issues, because if you look at what we have in the most chemical regulations in Asia, it is based on the conventional material. So there is no account, similar scenario, there is no account for particle size or surface area, where because you don't use the nano in big amount or big compound. And the registration requirement as well does not address the potential issues of nanoscale substance, which could be hidden. The information might not be disclosed by the manufacturers. Even though in Malaysia, for instance, you have the guideline of handling and identification of nanomaterial, it's particularly based on NIOSH, the US NIOSH at the moment, and of course taking into account on the ACAS as well, European Chemical Agencies. But this document is not binding, and of course it is voluntary on that note that the industry is not obliged to disclose the information. So next slide. So when it comes to the disclosure by the companies about the products containing nanoparticles, the regulators is so unlikely be able to force the company to provide the data. From my own experience, being part of the technical committee members, some companies are okay if they do, toxicology or ecotoxicology assessment. But whenever it comes to the LCA life cycle assessment, over 100 products has been actually participated in the project. However, only half of the companies actually being able to being volunteering to give information, because they don't want to disclose whether it has some effects to the environment. And also there is no obligations, there is no what we call it power on the part of the government's agency or regulatory authorities to force the company to disclose the production data. So most companies prefer not to disclose on that basis. However, when there is more safety testing protocol being introduced by the government, where the companies is convinced about the characterization and the assessment of risk and safety of nano products, that would be more companies to get involved. And of course, more incentive is introduced, but I think it's quite taking time, but it's better than for what we had in 10 years ago. Right, next. So as a classification issue when it comes to nanomaterial as hazardous substance, at the moment, similar things when it comes to registration or declaration, there is no differentiation or discrimination between nanoscale chemical and other counterparts. And this is what I mentioned about Korea just now. Next. And on the part of by-design paradigm in Asia, there are quite interesting development, and I've seen that in the first workshop that you had in 2020, right? Particularly on the issue of privacy by design, which I think this could be very interesting development in this region, because when you have more voluntary practices, the company would like to participate despite no obligation, but they encourage more data to be available in public. Next slide. So the EU recommendation is actually not new, and indeed is very helpful, I have to say, to set a benchmark strategy for nanotechnology development in this region. But there are a few things that this region needs to consider when it comes to adopting safe and sustainable by design for chemical materials or products. First thing, of course, the government needs to set a priority to determine what products which are mostly available in the market, and that so that it can be a good starting point to regulate the safety and also the sustainability of the products. And also when it comes to sustainability, when it comes to the raw material, some materials are being given attention by the government. For instance, in Malaysia, we do have focus on graphene or silver, nanosilver, which are more established and somehow stable material as what other regions has been doing as well. Secondly, when it comes to the alignment with the GHS system, at the moment, we do have what we call as class regulation, which classify the category of chemical which is hazardous or not, but still there is not quite clear differentiation on that. So there needs to be more safety testing, more research, because what we had in this region is different from the EU. The EU can actually do more testing, particularly when with regard to the nano-engineered scale substance, particularly at the upstream activities. But in this region, because it's mostly based on finished products, so it's gonna be quite challenging for the regulators to do the assessment. So the LCA, of course, is very important, even though from the result of the current studies that we do not quite see the direct impact to the environment. But there is very important to do more research to understand what are the tolerable level of safety risk and what the industry should do to mitigate the hazard to the human health and the environment. Next. So what's the future for this approach to Asia? While it could be more challenging, but it is promising, at least in the sense that it can encourage more companies to disclose. But of course, on the ground, we need to have stronger scientific knowledge in order to encourage or influence more industry to participate in this program. So sustainability may be not that immediate aim, but when you have a safety in place and sustainability perhaps will go together with the safety by design and also sustainability by design approach. But the question here is that when SSbD comes into the picture, the government need to decide whether they would like to focus on the product system or the life cycle using the chemicals or the chemicals used in the products. So the third one is perhaps more likely because looking into the condition we have currently in this region. And on this basis, it's very important to do the benchmarking studies, which Malaysia is currently doing. And some of the countries like Japan is more advanced because I still can recall, I have encountered this one researcher that have done the survey on the safety assessment of nanomaterial in food products. And we need more companies to participate in the LCA studies for the disclosure of the, not only on the risk, but also on the benefit or the intended benefit of the products to the consumer. Next. So these are among the questions perhaps we can actually propose the company when it comes to compliance purpose. The LCA should consider like the privacy by design approach. We focus on the impact assessment. And this would perhaps be more useful, particularly for the companies to avoid any potential litigation or lawsuit in future. Next. Next slide, please. All right. Yep, that's all for the presentation. So as a conclusion, I really applaud this move from the EU, which could be an important reference point as well to this region, and hopefully there will be more interesting development when it comes to the legal and regulatory activities. I look forward to discussion later. Thank you, Anthony.
Thank you very much, Nizam. And we will take questions after the presentation from Paul
Sure.
on the US perspective. And so that's because both of you are in different time zones. We can take the questions, which will be also questions to Hubert, to Ignasi, and also to Andrew. But thank you very much. And Paul, I give you immediately the floor for your presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anthony, and delighted to be able to participate in this session. Just a small disclaimer out of the way at the beginning that the opinions and the materials are my own and not those of my firm or any of our clients. So just by way of background, I am a litigator in the United States, addressing mass tort and chemical product issues. So I'm probably going to look at these issues and explain a little bit about the U.S. tort system and how that addresses chemical products issues. Of course, the U.S. has a regulatory system with TSCA and EPA and other things, but frequently we find that harms are addressed through the tort system, which is perhaps more robust than other parts of the world. We of course have a very active plaintiffs bar, so that we've been discussing the regulatory regimes, but I want to talk again about the U.S. tort system in this context. Part of the motivation for companies is avoiding tort liability. Just as a little, aside, we always talk about, what's the, from the defense as well from the plaintiff side, what's the next asbestos? And so we've been dealing in the U.S. with PFAS and talc and PCBs and Roundup. I don't know that we've seen much, in the way of nanotechnology litigation, but again, we'd like to avoid that, and the best way to do that, is to be aware of the science. There was a comment I remember reading years ago from really the U.S. Judge Jack Weinstein, who was considered the dean of mass torts in the United States, where lamenting that somewhat that the law lags behind the science. There's always that tension there. So just wanted to kind of put out some of the those observations or just perspective on the remarks that I'm going to give and some of the dynamics that I think are at work when it comes to looking at these issues from the U.S. system. Next slide, please. Okay, so again, I'm going to try and cover a lot of material, a lot of topics, and in varying degrees of depth, I suppose. So I want to talk about the general legal standards for product liability in the U.S. Some procedural and tactical considerations in U.S. product litigation, and I'm not sure how many lawyers we have, in the workshop, but I think some of those, are drivers of how the torts and tort cases might develop. And then I think there are some key issues and what I'll call key issues and trends that we see in chemical products cases that I think are worthy to note, again, to give a sense of the dynamics that are typically at work in the U.S. tort regime. So next slide, please. Okay, so product liability standards in the U.S. First, product liability is generally a matter of state law, not federal law. So there's not one uniform law across the board. There are variations. And I won't try and get into all of those. The legal bases for product liability under U.S. law. One is the concept of strict products liability, which is really a merger of negligence and contract. In a products liability case, in addition to pleading strict products liability, they'll typically be causes of action pled in negligence and breach of warranty for fitness. 3 types of defects will generally be claimed or can be claimed. Design defect, which is what we'll focus on today, manufacturing defect, and then failure to warn claims. Circle back on the failure to warn. Later I want to talk about the rise of consumer class actions as a way of addressing chemical product safety issues. And consumer class actions are essentially where the plaintiff is saying, you didn't tell me that X was in the product. You said this product is natural and it has chemicals in it, therefore you've misled me. That's not, technically speaking, that's not a failure to warn claim. Failure to warn is about particular risks, but it's kind of along the same theory. So we're going to talk about that a bit later. Next slide, please. Okay, so product liability standards. I've put up some language. This is from the Restatement of Torts on Product Liability. The restatement is really a combination or really a treatise overview of the different state standards that might apply, but that will be as close as you would get to the general standard. That's just saying the one who sells or distributes a defective product is subject to liability for the harm. Some of the comments from the restatement, as I alluded to, emerges the concept of implied liability or implied warranty where negligence is not required, with the tort concept of negligence in which contractual privity is not required. Anthony, I think one of the questions that you had on one of the introductory slides was whether designers could be liable, and I think under strict liability, that's I think where that breaks down a little bit, because you would never have the privity or the contract between the designer and the person who purchased the product, but strict liability we're imposing on those who sell, manufacture, distribute the products. Next slide, please. Okay, so this again from the restatement. A product is defective when, and this focuses on a design defect, so when the foreseeable risks of harm posed by the product could have been reduced or avoided by adoption of a reasonable alternative design, et cetera, et cetera. So a couple of things to point out here, which again I'll circle back on a little bit later. That we're looking at foreseeable risks, and so that in my mind, and particularly in the area of toxic tort and chemical products, when we're looking at foreseeability, we're always going to be thinking about causation and even more so exposure. Could the consumer be exposed to a sufficient amount of the harmful material to have an adverse health effect? So that's something that's going to go into the assessment of whether a design is defective. There's talk of reducing or avoiding the harm. Just a little bit more about my background. I've had the experience of litigating some of these issues in France and in Korea, and seen some decisions in some law where they talk about the manufacturer ceasing production until it could be determined that the risk was eliminated, which would be a higher burden than in the US. Next slide, please. One of the, and I'm sorry, so a design defect will be found, however, where a product is non-compliant with an applicable product safety statute or administrative regulation, which perhaps speaks to the evolving regulations in the in the nanotechnology area. On the other hand, compliance does not necessarily rule out a design defect. Again, just to have another layer of law that we have in the U.S., would be the issues of preemption, where the government has issued certain regulations, particularly labeling requirements, such that the manufacturer could not go beyond the prescriptions of a labeling requirement. So in that context, you could see a failure to warrant claim precluded. Next slide, please. So one of the, I mentioned before, reasonable alternative design. So that's just an element that the plaintiff would ordinarily need to prove. That would be the majority rule, that there was something that was practical, economically feasible to address, or rather, there was another way to make the product in an economically feasible way. Some jurisdictions express the reasonable alternative design element as a risk utility test. Does the risk outweigh the utility? There's a minority of states that speak to this as a consumer expectations test. So that is, would the reasonable consumer, the ordinary consumer, find the product to be unsafe? There are some types of defects where the plaintiff would not need to show a reasonable alternative design, where there were manifestly unreasonably safe products. Toy guns is an example that the restatement uses, or non-compliant products under the product safety statutes. Next slide, please. Okay, so some procedural and I'll say tactical considerations in a U.S. product liability lawsuit. Again, for some of the lawyers that might be in attendance, because we have state law, we've dealt a lot with forum shopping. I'd rather be in California than Missouri, or plaintiffs will seek to litigate or consolidate their cases in what are referred to as judicial hellholes. Those are the ones where the extraordinary or nuclear verdicts are rendered. In many other jurisdictions, the civil law jurisdictions, there are not juries in civil cases, and so the damage awards are not nearly as great, with the cases being presented to judicial panel on the paper. So there are different dynamics there, but that's something that will go into the tactics when tort cases are brought on chemical products. Just to back up a little bit on that notion, I think that in the U.S. Again, that we resolve or deal with or address harms through the tort system. Of course, we have a very robust plaintiffs bar that provides or the opportunity, the impetus, to do that. So I think that we end up having a lot of our regulation, perhaps after the fact, as it were, as a practical matter. I talked about state law applying, frequently from a defense perspective. You want to remove a case to federal court. That could be based on either diversity jurisdiction, so where you have suits between citizens of different states. So the corporation is in Michigan and the plaintiff is a New York citizen. We sue in cases brought in New York, and it's possible to remove it to federal court. I've put up government contracted defense there. Government contracted defense is essentially that the manufacturer followed the government's specifications for a product, and so then would have an ability to remove it as a federal officer under federal officer jurisdiction. We see that in the asbestos context, for instance, where a plaintiff claims exposure to asbestos while working on ship construction, just as an example. And there are other instances that come at that, but that's probably getting in a little too much detail. We also have class actions and multi-district litigations, which again, way of multiplying damages. One of the key battleground issues in any toxic tort case will be the admissibility of expert testimony. Federal courts were given an evidentiary gatekeeper role in the seminal Daubert case. Over time, courts frequently deferred on admissibility as being an issue of weight for the jury. Federal Rules of Evidence was recently amended to reinforce the gatekeeper role to compel rulings on admissibility rather than weight. Again, I know some of those issues, dealing with jury trials, don't apply in the civil law jurisdictions, but just wanted to go over some of those to give an overview of the U.S. product liability law. Next slide, please. So, want to talk about really some toxic tort issues and considerations that come up in these litigations, which I think bear upon some of the issues that are being dealt with the safe by design paradigm. To parrot or rephrase the location idiom, causation. That's typically the driver in a toxic tort case. Two elements to that under the U.S. system: general causation, can the substance at issue cause the harm? Specific causation, did it cause the harm? And that's going to be mostly or significantly an issue of exposure and dose. Did the plaintiff receive a dose? The poison's in the dose. Were there other potential causes of the plaintiff's injury? Were there other potential sources of the offending substance? Exposure and causation, while they're elements of the liability case, might also bear upon the existence of a design defect. That kind of goes to the point that I spoke about before in looking whether there are foreseeable risks, and that perhaps also touches upon particularly in exposure, when we look at foreseeable risks, is there a is there a reason to regulate a product in the first place? Again, trying to tie in these different ways of coming at these issues. It's important to distinguish between exposure and dose. They're not the same thing. Exposure is what's out there. Dose is what actually gets into the body. There's lots of differences, important distinctions when we're looking at exposure in the context of a toxic tort litigation between occupational exposure and consumer exposure. One of the things that we've seen in recent years is the development of consumer class actions as alternatives to classic product defect tort cases, presumably because you don't have to prove causation in those cases. It's just that I was misled. I didn't know that this substance was in the product I was buying. And that would be, I think, something that would, fit in the potentially fit in the nanotechnology sphere. Next slide, please. So, for general causation, to answer the question of whether a condition, might result from exposure to a particular substance, we're of course looking at the epidemiology on the issue. whether or not regulatory standards may establish a causal link. I would say that under the U.S. law, the answer to that would generally be no, not standing alone. So we have IR classifications of carcinogenicity, for instance, but those don't include any type of exposure analysis. You have EPA risk assessments, but those regulations are usually based on a 1 in a million increase in risk. Recently in one of the major mass tort litigations, the Roundup case, the court, the MDL, it's the multi-district litigation court, ruled that the conclusions were not proof of causation, that the underlying science needed to be examined. So in this context, I've put up a note there. There's a battleground over the scientific literature, and so that's again really kind of a theme through this, I suppose. Again, just some observations on the dynamics that we see in the U.S. I think I alluded before, from the plaintiff's side, they're looking for the new asbestos. They're looking for a scientific paper that talks about a signature disease, for instance, that glyphosate is linked to non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. I think are one of the more recent examples, that we saw, where that certain substances in hair straightener products increase the risk of uterine cancer. So that scientific paper comes out, and then we start to see some cases on that. Endocrine disrupting chemicals, is a focus, that we see in the literature, or that's focused on by the plaintiff's bar, as well as epigenetic effects. I know that we've seen a lot of literature on that. So again, those might be issues, or certainly areas or health effects, that might be looked at in connection with nanotechnology. I think nanotechnology probably also has an element similar to the PFAS issues. PFAS, being referred to as forever chemicals. And I'll talk a little bit about that aspect in a bit. And I was going to talk a little bit about some of the attacks on industry science, the plaintiff side type of literature, but we'll leave that for another day, because I see that I think we're running a little bit behind the agenda. I hope that I'm not talking too fast, as New Yorkers are apt to do. Next slide, please. Okay, so as I said, exposure and dose are a linchpin. We frequently, have a excuse me. So I'm sorry. So there's this kind of a tension with the idea that dose and exposure need to be strictly quantified. And how do you do that when you're looking at exposures that took place 10, 20 years ago, as opposed to a no safe limit or single fiber, single molecule theory, on the other side. As I said, exposure and dose are not interchangeable. I think I'll try and skip through a little bit of this in the interest of time, and you can look at the slides later. There's important precedent from the New York Court of Appeals. That's New York Highest Court, the Nemeth case, which talked about exposure in the talc context. Next slide, please. Okay, and the and the court really there reinforced the notion or the element, the requirement that the plaintiff needed to prove their level of exposure. It's not impossible to do. Next slide, please. And just on the point of the difference between exposure and dose, in the Nemeth case, the plaintiff's expert had done a test of putting some of the powder in a plastic box and then measuring the fibers that were points in the box. And the court said, well, that's not enough. You would need to show how much would actually be inhaled. So just as a demonstration of difference between exposure and dose. Next slide, please. Okay, so I think I've said that the first bullet point a little bit before. The analysis of exposure and dose, not only important as an element of the liability, but that tracks back to when looking at foreseeable risk. As an element of whether there's a defect at the outset. And that connection is the difference between workplace exposure and exposure to the final product. This was one of the cases that I liked, the Newkirk case, where you have a plaintiff, claiming that he developed a lung disorder by eating too much microwave popcorn, or I guess being exposed to the flavoring agents in there. But the court ruled he couldn't rely on studies regarding occupational exposure. We have a quote there also from the Agent Orange case, or one of the Agent Orange cases from the Vietnam War. This was in context of the government contractor defense, but that was one where the court found that the manufacturer's knowledge of the incidence of a skin condition due to workplace exposure did not provide evidence of knowledge of risks as the herbicide would be encountered by the troops. Next slide, please. Okay, so I alluded to earlier alternatives to classic product defect tort cases. One of these, or one of the big things in this area, I think, is the development or the evolution of consumer class actions based on misleading claims about products. Two things: avoids the burdens of proving the traditional claim, actually having to put forth all the science, and also those claims can be brought as a class action. So examples of that: a food product is not natural if the crops were treated with pesticides or herbicides. The PFAS claims, forever chemicals. We saw seen cases brought regarding those, particularly the presence of PFAS in cosmetics, that contradicted the maker's claims of open, inclusive, and sustainable beauty, or again that was not natural. So that is, I think, an overview of the U.S. tort system, some of the issues that we grapple with. Guess another way that that we come at, or at least from the U.S. perspective, that we come at these the harms and how we address those. Again, through the tort system rather than regulation per se. But I hope that was helpful.
Thank you very much, Paul. And maybe the last slide, Beatrice.
Oh,
yes.
That's just me.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Paul. Maybe if you could just put now in a mode where we can see the speakers who are online and speakers who are here. We will take questions. We are just a little bit behind the agenda, but this is not a problem because we have some flexibility in the second part of the session, so don't worry about it. And there is immediately a question from Andrew. Yes. The question is you have to come here, Andrew, because otherwise our speakers who are online won't be able to hear you.
Hello, folks. Paul, I was very interested in the last. Now you can see me perhaps a bit, half of me. I was very interested in your last few slides, and I wondered how legally binding scientific literature is on a legal issue. For instance, if a plaintiff comes up with some compound having given them some life-threatening disease, and they've seen does it have to be a specific journal, or does it have to be corroborated research, or what? Because I noticed you put scientific literature down as one of the sources of evidence.
Sure, that's a great question, Andrew. Thank you. So, really, in the U.S. context, I think break that down maybe break that down into two ways. So, that we're very much going to have in the U.S. Toward action, a battle of the experts. So I'm going to put in my experts. The plaintiff is going to put in their experts, and hopefully, a court and a jury can understand the science. That's a real challenge. So that's one of the reasons. Why I guess a couple of things I alluded to, the Daubert case, or the issue of admissibility of expert testimony. That's something that that's going to be challenged. And so again, part of that is battle of the experts. There's a wide variation in the quality of the scholarship. I'm sure that you've seen it. On one hand, you've got the really esteemed peer-reviewed journals. On the other hand, you have the open access journals, which are not as which are probably not as well regarded or as rigorous in their review. So as a practical matter, that's going to be part of what we call an in limine motion before trial, to such that the experts would be testimony would be admitted, and that's just another battle that goes into the process. There's no easy answer to that. I'll just say, as a U.S. lawyer, when I've been in other jurisdictions which don't necessarily have these evidentiary safeguards, that's always a question that we're asked, and it's almost, well, mostly anything can go in, and we'll just talk about it as a question of weight. So that's a great question, but that's just another battle that we fight, and really that can be a linchpin, in a case of whether the expert's admitted or not.
Thank you. Is there any other question from someone online or somebody here in the room? No question. Well, it seems that I would say presentations were clear enough for the audience. So if there is no question at this stage, please just remember that Nizam and Paul won't normally stay online. So of course, take the opportunity of their presence to raise a question. But apparently it's not the case. Well, then we will go for a 15-minute coffee break here in Grenoble, or online at home or at the office. Nizam, Paul, thank you very much again for your two presentations. And indeed, so for everyone, we come back here at 4:10 p.m. Central European Time, and then we continue with the second part of the workshop. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anthony. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you.